Only I came to my husband's funeral. Not our son, not our daughter, not a single grandchild. Just me, standing by his coffin while the cold wind whipped through the chapel courtyard, as if even the weather couldn't bear to stay. The air smelled faintly of lilies and wet marble. The pews were empty except for my handbag resting beside me, a quiet mockery of company. The funeral director kept glancing toward the door, eyes flicking between the vacant seats and my face. He cleared his throat once, then again. "Would you like us to wait a few more minutes, Mrs. Holloway?" I shook my head. "No. Start." George would have hated a delay. He nodded, almost relieved to have direction, and signaled the pastor. George had always been punctual, even in his last days. He took his pills by the clock, watched the evening news at 6 sharp, folded his slippers side by side before bed, as though the smallest rituals could keep time itself from unraveling. A man of habit, a man of dignity, and now a man laid to rest alone. The pastor began to speak, his voice trembling against the wind that kept trying to steal his words away. He recited scripture without conviction, glancing down at the folded paper as though it belonged to someone else. The flowers were too bright, the casket too polished. I couldn't stop thinking how George would have laughed at the fuss, at the stiffness of it all. He would have glanced around, frowning, and asked where the hell the kids were. Where were they? A message had come that morning. Our son, Peter, sent a one-liner. "Sorry, Mom, something came up. Can't make it." No explanation, no call. I imagined him at his office, or more likely on a golf course with clients, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, pretending not to feel the weight of the day, pretending his father's death was just a small inconvenience in a busy schedule. Our daughter Celia hadn't even sent a message, just a voicemail 2 days earlier, breezy as a spring wind. "Mom, I really can't cancel my nail appointment. You know how anxious I get with reschedules? Tell Dad I'll visit him next week." Next week. As if dead men wait. When the pastor finally said amen, the word fell flat, swallowed by the hollow air. The coffin gleamed beneath the gray light. I followed behind the pallbearers, their black coats fluttering like dark wings. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't grieving, I had been grieving for months, but because there's a kind of sorrow that sits motionless inside you, like an anchor, too heavy to move, too deep to show. And that day, I was already buried under it. The cemetery was nearly deserted. One old groundskeeper watched from a distance, his hand resting on a spade, head bowed. The coffin was lowered, the prayers whispered. Dust met wood. Wood met silence. I stayed behind long after the others left. My heels sank into the soft earth. The wind tugged at my coat, carrying the scent of damp soil and wilted roses. There was no headstone yet, just a simple temporary plaque. George Holloway, beloved husband, father, forgotten. The word forgotten stuck in my mind like a stone in my shoe. When I got home, the quiet roared. His recliner sat untouched, his slippers side by side, the TV remote where he last left it. His reading glasses still rested on the coffee table, a folded crossword underneath, unfinished. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence hum around me. Then I went to the kitchen, opened a bottle of wine, one of the good ones we used to save for guests, and poured a glass. The first sip burned a little. The second didn't. I took out my phone, almost without thinking, and opened Instagram. I don't scroll much. George used to call it the digital circus. But something inside me, curiosity, pain, anger, I'm not sure which, told me to look. Celia's profile was public, of course. She had posted 2 hours ago a picture of her and 3 girlfriends, drinks in hand, mid-laughter. Caption: Girls' brunch, bottomless mimosas, living our best lives. I stared at it for a long moment before moving to Peter's page. His post was a snapshot of the 9th hole. His new golf driver glinted in the sun. Caption: Killer swing, perfect weather, deals made. I put the phone down slowly, like it might explode. The screen went black, reflecting my face back at me, drawn, tired, older than I remembered. Then I turned toward the wall, to the photo of George and me on our 40th anniversary. We stood beside the rose bushes he'd planted with his own hands, both of us smiling like fools. They used to bloom in rich, deep red. Now they were bare, the branches blackened by winter. Tomorrow, I thought, I'll call the lawyer. I'll make changes, quietly, privately, with the same dignity George lived by. If I was the only one to show up for his last goodbye, then I would be the only one to carry out his final will, and theirs. That evening, I made myself dinner, though I wasn't hungry. Soup from a can, a slice of bread I didn't finish. The clock ticked too loudly. It had been 2 weeks since George passed, but his presence still lingered in everything. The smell of his aftershave in the hallway, the faint outline of his shoes by the back door, the way the pipes groaned just before 6 when he used to start the bath. He used to peel apples in the kitchen with the precision of a surgeon, long curling ribbons falling into the sink. Then he'd line up the slices on a small plate and always offer me the best piece, the one with the most sunshine, he'd say. Now the fruit bowl sat untouched. 2 overripe pears sagged under their own skin. I sat at the table and stared out the window. The night was dark and restless, wind scraping the branches against the glass. I imagined George sitting across from me, the way he used to, reading the paper, occasionally glancing up to say something dry and thoughtful. But there was only the clock, only the ticking, only me. I thought about Celia's laughter in that photo, her perfectly painted nails holding a glass of champagne, about Peter's grin on the golf course, so effortless, so rehearsed. I'd raised a daughter who could sip cocktails while her father was lowered into the ground, and a son who measured life in deals and swing speed. Had I failed them? Or had they failed something inside themselves that could no longer be repaired? Maybe both. Outside, a branch cracked under the weight of the wind, sharp and sudden. I startled, spilling a little wine on the tablecloth. For a moment, it looked like blood. I set the glass down, hands trembling slightly. Tomorrow, I told myself again, tomorrow I'd call the lawyer. Tonight, I would sit in the silence and learn its shape. It was heavy, it was cruel, and it was mine now.
The morning after the funeral, the house felt different. Not emptier, just heavier. As if grief had settled into the walls overnight and was now breathing beside me. I woke early, before dawn, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink. The window was fogged, the world outside blurred and gray. For a long time, I just listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind against glass, the old house creaking like an aging heart. George used to rise early, too. I could almost hear him moving around the kitchen, humming under his breath while he waited for the kettle. He always hummed the same tune, Moon River, though he never remembered the words. I smiled despite myself, then caught the smile fading in the reflection of the window. I reached for the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. Caton and Blake, attorneys at law, a woman's voice answered. "This is Mrs. Holloway," I said quietly. "I'd like to schedule an appointment with Mr. Caton." There was a pause, then a softened tone. "Of course, Mrs. Holloway. I'm so sorry for your loss. Mr. Caton will see you this afternoon." The drive to the law office was short, but endless. Every red light stretched into a small eternity. George's old sedan still smelled faintly of his cologne, that dry cedar scent that lingered no matter how much I cleaned. I kept my hands at 10 and 2, the way he always insisted, though there was no one to correct me anymore. By the time I parked outside the brick building on Elm Street, my hands were shaking. Mr. Caton's office hadn't changed since I'd last been there with George. Mahogany shelves, heavy drapes, and a clock that ticked with the same deliberate patience as the man himself. He rose when I entered, a tall, silver-haired man with eyes that had seen too many secrets. "Mrs. Holloway," he said softly, taking my hand, "you have my condolences. George was a fine man." "Yes," I said, "he was." He gestured for me to sit. "I was surprised you called so soon. Most families need time before discussing wills." "I've had 2 weeks. That's time enough to realize who's still standing beside me and who isn't." Caton nodded slowly, folding his hands. "You mean Peter and Celia?" "I mean strangers who happen to share my last name." A flicker of sympathy crossed his face. He didn't interrupt. "I want to make some changes," I said, "to the estate, to everything." He leaned forward. "You know George's will left substantial assets to both children. I assume you don't want to revoke that lightly." "I don't want to revoke it. I want to revise it, so they earn it." "Earn it?" His brow lifted. "Yes." I took a breath. "I was the only one at his funeral, Mr. Caton. Not our son, not our daughter, not a single grandchild. They couldn't spare a morning to say goodbye to the man who gave them everything. I want them to remember him properly this time." Caton's gaze softened. "And how do you propose we do that?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. George was a man of order. He believed in effort, in meaning. I want to create conditions, tasks, if you will, something that forces them to look back at the father they ignored. Caton nodded, though his expression was wary. "You understand, of course, that conditional inheritance can get messy, contested, emotional." "Messy is fine," I said quietly. "They've lived too long in comfort." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You've changed since the last time I saw you, Margaret." "Grief changes people," I said. "But this isn't grief. It's clarity." When I left the office, the sky had darkened, clouds rolling like bruises over the town. The first drops of rain fell as I stepped outside. I didn't open my umbrella. By the time I reached the car, my coat was soaked through, but I didn't care. I sat in the driver's seat, raindrops tapping the windshield in chaotic rhythm, and felt something I hadn't felt since George died. A faint sense of control. Tomorrow, Caton would draft the new document. Tomorrow, the first thread of my plan would begin. That evening, I poured myself another glass of wine and sat in George's recliner. The indentation of his shoulders was still there, the faint smell of aftershave and leather. I closed my eyes and whispered into the silence. "You'd think I'm cruel for this, but you'd understand." For a moment, I could almost feel him, not as a ghost, but as memory pressing close, the kind that lingers in the air long after the sound has gone. I thought about the last conversation we had before the hospital took him. He'd held my hand, his grip weak but certain. "Don't let them drift too far," he'd said. "They'll need you when I'm gone." He didn't realize that they were already gone. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, the house felt restless. The wind had picked up again, rattling the branches outside. Somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter clapped against wood. I brushed my teeth, turned off the bathroom light, and paused at the hallway mirror. My reflection startled me. There was a hardness around my eyes I didn't recognize. I whispered to it, half to myself, half to him. "You taught them everything except how to stay." Then I turned away. At 11:47 p.m., the phone rang. The sound was sharp in the quiet. I froze, heart pounding. Who calls at that hour? I let it ring twice, then picked up. "Hello?" Nothing. Just breathing. Slow, shallow. "Who is this?" Still nothing. The line clicked dead. I stood there for a moment, phone in hand, pulse drumming in my ears, then replaced the receiver, convincing myself it was a wrong number, a telemarketer, a child prank. But deep down, something colder whispered otherwise. I locked the doors before going to bed. George used to say I never did. Morning came pale and thin. I opened the front door to find an envelope on the porch. No stamp, no name, just Margaret, written in George's handwriting. My knees almost buckled. My first thought was absurd, that he had written it yesterday, that he was still here somehow, leaving me a note before his morning walk. But the rational part of me knew better. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The ink was faded, the words simple. "If you're reading this, I trust you found strength where I left silence. Don't let them forget who we were. Not for money, for memory. G." Tears blurred the words. I sat down on the porch step, clutching the letter to my chest. "I won't," I whispered. "I promise, George. I won't let them forget." That night, I slept with the letter beside my bed. The phone didn't ring again, but I kept the light on just in case. Outside, the wind had quieted. The world was still. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the ache and the exhaustion, something had begun to stir. Something cold, determined, and certain. I didn't know it yet, but the dead had just given me permission.
2 days after the letter arrived, the phone rang again, but this time it wasn't silence. "Mom?" Peter's voice. Smooth, controlled, practiced. The kind of tone he used with clients when trying to sound empathetic. "Peter, I heard from Mr. Keaton. He mentioned you're making some changes to Dad's will." There it was. No condolences, no warmth, just business. "Yes," I said, "I am." A pause. "May I ask why?" "You may, but I'm not sure you'll like the answer." He exhaled through his nose, the sound crisp through the receiver. "Mom, look, I know things have been tense. The funeral, I interrupted, was empty." Another pause. He cleared his throat. "I'll come by tomorrow. We'll talk in person. Bring your sister. She's overdue for a visit." There was hesitation on the line. "I'll try." "No," I said quietly. "You'll come. Both of you." They arrived the next afternoon. The sound of tires on Grammel startled me from the kitchen. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and looked through the window as Peter's sleek black car came into view. Celia stepped out first, wearing oversized sunglasses and a fur-lined coat despite the mild weather. Peter followed,
tapping something into his phone before pocketing it with an air of practiced impatience. For a moment, they stood by the car, uncertain, as if unsure how to approach the house they'd both once run through barefoot as children. When I opened the door, Celia offered a half-smile. "Hi, Mom." "Celia." "You look well," she said, voice too bright. "You didn't see me at the funeral. That might have helped you make a more accurate observation." Her smile faltered. Peter stepped in, always the diplomat. "We're here now. That's what matters." "Is it?" I asked. "We'll see." We sat in the living room. The air between us felt thick with old ghosts and unspoken things. Peter took the armchair, George's chair, without realizing it. I said nothing, though the sight of him there felt like sacrilege. Celia perched on the sofa, crossing her legs delicately. "Mr. Keaton said something about you changing the inheritance?" "Yes," I said. "Your father left you both generous portions. But generosity without gratitude is wasteful." Peter frowned. "Mom, if this is about the funeral, it's about everything," I said sharply. The words surprised even me. "Your father deserved better from both of you. You weren't there when he was dying. You weren't there when I buried him. You weren't there when I came home to a house that still smells like him." Celia opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. "No excuses," I said. "You've made enough of those." They were silent. Peter stared at the carpet. Celia's painted nails picked at a thread on her sleeve. Finally, I said, "I've arranged something with Mr. Keaton. If you want to inherit your father's estate, you'll have to complete a task. A very specific one." Celia blinked. "A task?" "Yes. Your father always believed in earning what you receive. He wanted you to work for your worth, not just wait for it to be handed to you. So that's what you'll do." Peter's jaw tightened. "And if we don't?" "Then everything goes to charity," I said simply. "The Holloway Foundation. For families who actually stay together." The words hung in the air like a slap. That evening, the tension simmered. Peter made calls from the porch, whispering angrily. Celia drifted from room to room, looking at old photographs like a tourist in someone else's life. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the quiet ticking of the clock. When Peter finally came back inside, his face was tight with irritation. "All right, fine. What exactly do you want us to do?" "You'll both live here. For 30 days. "Here?" Celia's voice rose an octave. "In this old house?" "Yes. Together. Without your phones during the day. Without your work. Without your brunches. Just the three of us. Like before." Peter frowned. "That's ridiculous." "Your father's request." I lied. They froze. It wasn't true, not exactly, but it was something he might have said. After a long silence, Peter said, "What's the catch?" "You'll complete a task during your stay. One for each of you." I handed them both envelopes. Their names were written in George's handwriting, the same looping script I'd practiced a dozen times before daring to copy. Celia looked at hers warily. "You wrote these?" "They're from your father," I said softly. "They left them with Keaton before he died." Another lie, another mercy. They opened the envelopes. Peter's letter was short. "Build something with your hands, something real, something that doesn't earn applause or profit. Just effort." Celia's said, "Find something worth caring for. A living thing. Nurture it, protect it, and let it teach you patience."
Celia frowned. What is this? A game? Yes, a game of inheritance. That night, I couldn't sleep. I heard them arguing in the guest rooms, Peter's low voice sharp with disbelief, Celia's higher, trembling. At some point, the house fell silent again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of old wood. It felt strange having them here. The rooms that had been so empty now carried sounds again. Doors opening, footsteps in the hall, a cough, a sigh. But none of it felt like comfort. In the darkness, I whispered to George's side of the bed, I hope you forgive me for this, but they need to remember you somehow, even if it's through guilt. The shadows didn't answer, but the wind outside seemed to agree. Days passed slowly. Peter, ever the businessman, built a workbench in the shed, muttering under his breath as he tried to remember how to use a hammer. The first few days, he cursed more than he built. By the end of the week, the sound of wood striking wood became steady, almost therapeutic. Celia brought home a small potted rosebush. It's just a plant, she shrugged when I looked at it. But every morning I'd see her on the porch, trimming dead leaves, whispering to it like a secret. For the first time in years, the house began to breathe again. Sometimes I'd catch Peter staring at the photo of George in the hallway, or Celia pausing by his old recliner, tracing her finger along the armrest as if remembering something. They didn't say it out loud, but the silence between us began to soften. One evening, while setting the table, Celia spoke quietly. Mom, do you ever think Dad knew we'd end up like this, so distant? I looked up. He worried about it. Did he say that? I hesitated. He didn't have to. Peter joined us, his shirt stained with sawdust. He placed a small box on the table. Inside were a few old photos. George holding a baby Peter, George teaching Celia to ride a bike. There was also a folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. I unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, written in George's instackable handwriting. If they forget me, remind them that love is not a gift. It's labor. I stared at the words until they blurred. That night, after they'd gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The letter lay beside the candlelight, its edges trembling slightly in the draft. Maybe this was what George meant when he told me not to let them drift too far. But something in me stirred uneasily, a feeling I couldn't name. If this was about teaching them love, why did it suddenly feel like I was the one being tested?
By the second week, the house had started to remember how to live again. The air no longer felt stagnant. The scent of sawdust mingled with the faint sweetness of rose petals. Dishes clinked, floors creaked, and laughter, tentative, unfamiliar, occasionally filled the silence. If I hadn't known better, I might have thought we were healing. But healing, I've learned, often comes with pain first. Peter's project, as he called it, had taken over the old shed. Every morning, he was out there before breakfast, sleeves rolled up, hammer echoing through the garden. I'd stand by the window and watch him sometimes, his movements awkward at first, then steadier, more deliberate. He was building a bench, he said, in honor of Dad. When I asked where it would go, he shrugged. Maybe near the roses. Celia, on the other hand, had adopted a strange devotion to her rosebush. She'd brought it into the sun every morning, watered it precisely, trimmed it delicately, as though tending to it were penance. She never said so, but I could see it in her eyes, the quiet shame of someone trying to grow what she'd once neglected.
One afternoon, I found her in the garden, staring down at the rose bush with tears on her cheeks. "Celia," she wiped her face quickly, "it's nothing, just the flowers aren't blooming. I've done everything right, but it's not enough." Her voice cracked. I knelt beside her. The soil was damp, cool beneath my fingertips. "Sometimes things take time," I said. "They don't bloom when we want them to." She looked at me, eyes wide, desperate. "Was Dad disappointed in me, Mom? Be honest." The question lodged in my throat. I wanted to tell her no, that George adored her endlessly, that she was his sunshine girl, but truth has a way of pressing through grief like roots through concrete. "He was sad," I said softly. "Not disappointed, just sad that he didn't know how to reach you anymore." She nodded, biting her lip. Then she whispered, "I didn't know how to reach him either." For the first time in years, she looked like a little girl again. That evening, Peter came in from the shed carrying a small box. "Found something you'll want to see," he said. Inside were a few old receipts, a rusted key, and several folded letters tied with twine. The handwriting was unmistakably George's. I untied the bundle carefully, the paper brittle with age. The first letter was addressed to me. "Margaret, if you're reading this, I suppose I never found the courage to say what needed saying out loud. There are things I've kept from you, not from deceit, but from fear. I didn't want you to carry my burdens, the illness, the money troubles, the mistakes. I wanted to spare you the heaviness of knowing. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe love isn't about sparing each other pain, but sharing it." I stopped reading, the words trembling in my hands. "Mom?" Peter asked gently. I forced a small smile. "It's nothing, dear, just your father being sentimental." But my heart knew better. The illness, the money troubles, the mistakes. What had he hidden? That night, I searched through the filing cabinet in his study. The drawers smelled faintly of ink and cedar. At the back, behind old tax forms, I found a folder labeled Medical. My fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside were hospital records, scans, test results, treatment schedules. The dates stretched back nearly 3 years. He'd known he was dying long before he told me. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. My throat tightened. I sank into his chair, the papers shaking in my lap. All those nights he'd said he was tired from work, the skipped dinners, the quiet trips to town. He'd been going to treatment, alone. A sob rose unbidden. I pressed my mouth to my hand, the sound muffled and raw. He'd hidden it to protect me, to protect them. And in doing so, he died carrying it all by himself. The next morning, I couldn't face the garden. I sat by the window, the letter open beside me, the hospital papers tucked underneath. When Celia came in, she stopped short at the sight of my face. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Your father was sick longer than I thought," I said quietly. She froze. "What do you mean?" I told her everything. The hidden treatments, the records, the letters. By the time I finished, she was crying openly. Peter came in halfway through, his expression unreadable. He listened silently, arms crossed. When I handed him one of George's letters, he unfolded it slowly. It was addressed to him. "Peter, I was proud of you long before you became what you are, but I fear I taught you to chase success instead of meaning. I hope one day you'll see that building a life isn't the same as building a legacy." Peter didn't speak for a long time. Then he whispered, "He knew. He knew I was becoming someone he didn't like." "He loved you anyway," I said. "That's the difference." The rest of the week passed quietly. Something had shifted, not just in the house, but in us. Peter worked in silence now, no longer cursing under his breath. I noticed him sanding the bench slower, his hands gentler. Celia's rosebush began to sprout new buds, tiny, tentative, but alive. One evening, I walked out to the garden just as the sun was setting.
Peter was tightening the last screw on the bench. Celia was kneeling beside her plant, humming softly. For a moment, the scene looked almost like forgiveness made visible. I felt George's presence then, not in some supernatural way, but in the stillness, in the sound of the wind through the leaves, in the sight of our children working side by side. I whispered, "You'd like this, George. You'd finally like this." That night, I couldn't sleep again. I got up and went outside. The moon was pale, the garden silvered under its light. The roses had started to bloom, deep, crimson, fragile, perfect. Celia had left her watering can by the steps. Peter's bench sat beneath the largest rosebush, smooth and sturdy, his initials carved quietly in the corner. I sat down on it, running my fingers over the grain. It was solid, real, honest. For the first time since George's death, I didn't feel alone. The next morning, a knock at the door broke the calm. Mr. Keaton stood there, hat in hand, his expression grave. "Mrs. Holloway, I thought it best to tell you in person. There's been an issue." My stomach tightened. "What kind of issue?" He hesitated. "Apparently, there was a business deal years ago, one that never resolved. They're suggesting he concealed assets." I felt the air leave my chest. "That's impossible." "I hope so," he said, "but you should know they're threatening to contest the will." After he left, I stood by the window again, watching Peter and Celia in the garden. They looked different now, softer, quieter, maybe even humbled. But my thoughts were elsewhere. Had George hidden more than just his illness? I went to the study again, searching the drawers. That's when I found it. Another letter, tucked inside a faded envelope marked, "For when the truth comes knocking." I opened it with trembling fingers. "Margaret, if someone comes asking about the Holloway accounts, tell them the truth. There's nothing left to take. What I gave you, I earned. What I hid for them. I only hope they'll one day understand the price of what we tried to build." Tears filled my eyes. The price. He'd protected us, even from ruin. That evening, I lit a candle by his photo. The flame flickered, catching the reflection of his smile. I whispered, "I know now. I finally understand." Outside, I heard laughter. Peter's low rumble, Celia's softer echo. For a first time in years, it sounded real. The roses swayed in the wind, red and alive. And I thought, maybe, just maybe, George had won it all.
Morning came heavy with fog, the kind that wrapped the garden in silence and made every breath visible. The roses glistened, beaded with dew. I stood by the kitchen window, coffee cooling in my hand, and thought about how strange it felt. Peace, arriving in the same house that once echoed with nothing but grief. George's photo still sat by the candle I'd lit the night before. The wax had hardened around the base, as though sealing our farewell in time. But peace, as I was about to learn, never stays untested for long. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Mr. Keaton stood there again, this time with a folder in his hand and a furrow on his brow. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I've been contacted again by that creditor's representative. He's insisting on a meeting today." Peter, overhearing from the hallway, stepped forward. "A meeting about what?" Keaton sighed. "It seems your father had business interests that no one declared. A trust overseas, legally questionable, according to them." Celia's eyes widened. "You mean Dad hid money?" I shook my head slowly. "No, he hid us." They both looked at me confused. "I found another letter," I said. "He knew this was coming. He said he hid what was left, not for himself, but for us, for protection." An hour later, the four of us, Keaton,
Peter, Celia, and I sat in the lawyer's office. Across the polished table sat a man in a gray suit, lean and cold-eyed. His name was Mr. Halford, representing the claimant. He wasted no time. Mr. Holloway owed our firm $200,000 from a failed development investment 15 years ago. We have records of a trust he later established to conceal residual assets. Keaton cleared his throat. You'll need evidence that the trust still exists. Halford smiled faintly. We have it. An offshore account opened in your late husband's name. The transfer history stopped only months before his death. My pulse thudded. And where do you think that money is now? Here, Halford said, tapping the folder, in a domestic estate account. Frozen, pending resolution. Peter leaned forward. So you're trying to take everything from our mother because Dad tried to keep something for us? Halford met his gaze. I'm simply restoring what's owed. The room fell to a thick, tight silence. I felt the ghosts of George's choices crowding around us. Then Mr. Keaton spoke quietly. Mrs. Holloway, he said softly, I see this isn't a debt. It's a repayment. Look here. He turned the page towards me. The last transaction showed a transfer from the Holloway Trust to a Children's Hospital Foundation. The note field read, in memory of Margaret's mother. George had donated the money, all of it, under my name. Celia gasped, he gave it away? I nodded, tears forming. He did. Every last cent. Keaton looked at Halford. You'll find, sir, that there are no assets to seize. The trust was dissolved legally. If anything, Mr. Holloway's last act was charity. Halford's jaw tightened. After a moment, he gathered his papers in silence and stood. Then my client will withdraw the claim. And just like that, he was gone. When we got home, Peter set his keys on the counter and exhaled hard. All this time, I thought Dad was running from his mistakes, he said. Turns out he was fixing them in his own way. He always was a fixer, I said, smiling faintly, even if he didn't always fix the right things. Celia came to stand beside me, her eyes soft. You think he knew how this would turn out? I think I knew he'd have to find our way to forgiveness ourselves. That afternoon, we buried the final letter. Not in the ground, but beneath the rose bush, the one that Celia had brought to life again. We wrapped the paper in a small cloth and placed it beneath the roots. He wrote this garden into his story, I said, pressing the soil gently. Let it stay part of him. Peter knelt beside me, and part of us. We stood together for a while, silent, but not alone. The sun broke through the clouds, spilling light over the bench Peter had built. The roses glowed crimson, almost defiant, against the soft green. That evening, I made dinner for the three of us. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the kind George used to love. We sat around the table like we hadn't in years. Halfway through the meal, Celia reached for my hand. Mom, she said, voice trembling, I'm sorry for the brunch, for not coming to the funeral, for everything. Peter added quietly, me too. I should have been there, for him, for you. I looked at them both, my children, flawed, frightened, and finally honest. I forgave you the moment I stood alone by that grave, because grief doesn't ask for perfection, it only asks for presence. And you're here now. That's enough. Later, after they'd gone to bed, I stepped out into the garden one last time. The night was warm, the air humming with the faint scent of roses. I sat on the bench, tracing my fingers over the initials carved into the wood, P.H., Peter's mark of love. Then I looked at the roses, their petals trembling softly in the breeze. I didn't see absence when I looked at them. I saw continuity. George hadn't left me. He'd simply passed the torch, from his hands to mine, from mine to theirs. I took out my phone and opened a new message. Not to post, not to share, just to write. George, today I learned you left us with less money but more truth. You gave our children a second chance, even if it meant they'd find out who you really were. Not perfect, but real. I think that's all any of us can hope for. Rest now. We're finally okay. I pressed save as draft. Some words, I decided, don't need to be sent. They just need to be written. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The light was pink and soft, filtering through the curtains. I went to the window and saw something that caught my breath. Celia's rosebush had sprouted one new bloom overnight. It was the deepest, richest red I had ever seen. I stepped outside in my robe, barefoot on the cool grass. I touched the flower gently, its petals warm from the first hint of sun. And in that quiet moment, I felt him again. Not as a memory, not as a loss, but as something living. The wind shifted. The chimes near the porch sang a soft, trembling note. I smiled. "Good morning, George." The roses swayed in answer, and for the first time since his death, I didn't feel like the only one who came to say goodbye.